we've been talking about huge topics. This one is a little teeny one. And so I can go quickly. I hope it's not too mundane for you. This project was done with Beth Cooperman, colleague of mine at University of Colorado, Denver. We've all seen this sort of a slide today. We kind of know that story. That's the kind of context that we're talking about fossil fuel reserves compared to carbon budget. We also know that the CO2 embedded in different types of fossil fuels varies. Here's coal. This is kind of the average of several different types of coal. This is diesel. This is without Volkswagen's. This is natural gas. This is natural gas without fugitive emissions added, and that would raise it. And so the measurement problems are severe, but this kind of gives the relative composition of those energy sources. We've already met Professor Elkins today, and I think a lot of us are citing his work. We know that a lot of reserves probably can't be extracted and combusted if we're going to reach a G3 target. We've heard over and over again today that there are various reasons carbon risk isn't being priced. And we also know that equity valuations are going to have to adjust if and when that does happen. And so our project was to look at something pretty simple, whether technology could come to the rescue of coal and whether investors felt like it was a solution or salvation. And we know that's happened before. Here's this Malthusian crisis and technological advances in agricultural production as well as additions to land base have solved that over and over again. So technology can solve some pretty major problems. So what we do is, I go 2 or 1. First of all, we ask this question. Do investors in coal companies think that carbon capture and sequestration can help coal production or that industry? That's the question that we're asking. We get all the major North American coal producers, Canada and the US. We had a bigger sample about a year ago, but they kept going bankrupt. And then there was one that didn't go bankrupt, but the stock was selling for so little, pennies, that there would be no change in price, a 25% change in price. And it sort of fouled up our event study methodology. And so our sample was shrinking in time. So we have a real-time experiment going on here. Mark Fulton documented it earlier. What we did was we looked for relatively clean announcements. And when I say relatively, I'll tell you what that means right now. We wanted announcements that had no other confounding announcements close to them. Dividends, bankruptcies, those sort of things. Carbon capture technology breakthroughs or setbacks. And I'll give you some examples of what those were here. So here's an example of a breakthrough in blue. Swiss scientists find a new way that's going to require less energy. You know, when you have carbon capture and sequestration, Professor Sokolow would be able to talk to this much better than I. It takes up, 15-20% of the energy from a power plant to capture. Is that a normal 15 or 20%, you think? Yeah. So if you can do it with less energy, it's going to be less expensive and so on. Here's a project where, this is in Canada, the carbon capture system there exceeded expectations. So good news. This would suggest that carbon capture technology might actually be operational, commercial level, and whatnot. Then we have other setback announcements, and this is an example of one. A lot of these are funding based. So the funding is withdrawn. The project is closed. There's overrunning costs, a delay in production, under capture estimates, and that sort of thing. We developed a couple hypotheses. This is the one that would probably be the most obvious just from the title of the paper and what I've said already, that carbon capture sequestration breakthroughs are going to be associated with positive stock price reactions. The symmetric one for setbacks is going to be negative stock price reactions. Relating back to Katie's talk about behavioral things, we could get an asymmetric response where there's no response to CCS setbacks because of information avoidance, kind of a form of cognitive dissonance. It could also be that the price of the stranded assets has been incorporated, that investors feel like sort of all is lost. And so bad news about carbon capture just isn't embedded. And then there's a time relative to, or a time aspect to this where as people learn more and more about this field, the reactions are going to be larger. So we expect a larger reaction over the sample period. Oops, did I get to it again? Yeah. We do a standard event study. For those of you who aren't familiar with financial research, you look at a stock price reaction over a 2-day window, 3-day window. You try to make sure there's no confounding events. You compute abnormal returns, which are excess returns over what was expected based on a market model, based on beta, and pretty standard conventional methodology. And what we get is, for good news events, an average response here is abnormal return, actual over expected, of about 3 and 3.1%, and that has a p-value down here about 2%, so significant at all those normal levels. For bad news, it's minus 1.4%, but not very significant, p-value 10 or 11%. We break this into early and late periods. Early in the period, that would be roughly 2011, 12, and 13. No significant responses here. But later in the period, for good news, big response. For bad news, again, no response. Okay. We do a similar kind of test using a different methodology, something related to seemingly unrelated regressions based on John Binder's work on regulatory event studies. And we get qualitatively identical results. Significant for good news, p-value there. Not for bad news, significant later in the period as this information permeates the market and investors become more sensitized to it. And so what we have then significant positive reactions to carbon capture, sequestration breakthroughs, larger responses later in the period, as presumably investors get more sensitized to this issue. No significant stock price reaction to negative news about carbon capture technology. Keep aiming at the screen rather than the computer. That's not where it is it? So our results we see as consistent with investors in coal companies seeing carbon capture technology as something that is going to add value to their resource. The results are asymmetric. There's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that this bad news has been incorporated into prices, contrary to what several speakers have suggested earlier today. It could be this cognitive dissonance sort of argument, behavioral avoidance of bad information or bad news. They just don't want to believe it, so they ignore the bad news about carbon capture and sequestration technology. Or it could be a too big to fail kind of argument that some people have alluded to, and I think we're going to hear more about tomorrow. I think there's a paper on that tomorrow. So we kind of like the first explanation, that a lot of this risk has been incorporated in these prices. This is the Stowe Global Coal Index. This is 28 or 30 companies. There are coal producers from around the world, as well as transporters, technology companies, and companies that make mining equipment. And that's what it's done over the last, it's 2010, end of 2010, so 2011 through mid-2015. this is our portfolio of sample companies, and we've taken out all of the bankrupt companies, or it would descend at a faster rate than this. And just to put this in a little teeny bit of context, the McGlade and Elkins paper suggested a reduction, if you recall, of about 82% coal reserve not being able to be extracted and burned. You know, this index has come down 90% already. And so, you know, that makes pretty good sense. The idea of avoidance, when you look at numbers like this, I suppose that you could selectively avoid news about stranded assets. But if you're going to do that, why would the index go down so far? If you think you're too big to fail, why would the index go down so far? So as we put this together a week or so ago, we realized that what we really need to do then is tease out the reasons for this big decline, and that's something that we're going to start on. And hopefully if Ben, or I think he invited someone else to host this gathering in the future, if there is one, I hope that we can present something that tries to explain this large fall. Is it just coal prices? And is it regulatory events? Is it something else? So that's about all we have. Asymmetric results. I said that the most compelling explanation was that some of this risk had been priced into the coal companies, and it just, to me, makes a lot more sort of interesting projects to work on in the future. So all you young people in the room have lots and lots of neat things to work on, it seems to me.